Before we begin, allow me to paint you the full picture. General Radahn is cursed ever to walk. Eaten from the inside by Melania's scarlet rot, his wits are long gone. Now he gathers the corpses of former friends and foes alike, gorging on them like a dog.
Welcome back to the Honored Madman Cooking Show, and today we're going to be talking about the lands between cuisine. So this isn't the verdant fields and hills of Oblivion, where you can eat all manner of food, or Skyrim, where cheese wheels grow on trees, or Breath of the Wild, in which there is more food recipes than there is weapons. And it's not Dark Souls, where you don't really need to eat because you're undead. No, this is something different altogether. It's probably somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. It's sort of like the A Song of Ice and Fire books or the Lord of the Rings books, where potatoes don't exist, for example, even though they do in the show and movies in those respective cases. So today we're going to go over some of the delicacies and the foods of the lands between and surrounding regions, perhaps even the lands underneath as well. Now, if you're familiar with the work of George R. R. Martin or just the streams of AltSwiftX and Glidus, you know that George is sort of known for his food descriptions. He's known for both describing some amazing sounding feasts and some totally disgusting food that main characters will have to eat in order to survive. He even uses food as a way to establish the economical situation of a household that he's depicting, or more often than not, just the contrast between classes. But with Elden Ring, it's a little bit different. I mean, there's some creatures that just aren't capable of eating. Look at the average troll. They appear to have had their stomachs removed and replaced with a box fan or something. I guess it's safe to say there really isn't much of a troll cuisine in the game. But what's up with food production in the lands between anyway? You don't really see any ruined fields. There's some windmills, sure, but they don't appear to be storing any type of grain, and where would the grain have been grown, since we haven't seen any fields? Plus, I'm pretty sure that the main cut of meat they're feasting on at Windmill Village is of the human variety. We see the ancestral Minotaur guys gathering flowers and herbs, presumably to eat, which would make sense because they seem to have like this connection with animals. They're nature guys, so of course they're vegetarian. There's a great degree of shipwrecks in Caelid and in the Weeping Peninsula that suggests maybe they imported their food from other lands. So there's no fields really to speak of, and no mills or silos that seem to be functional or housing any grain, but there is a lot of wildlife, both seafood and otherwise. You can find all manner of weird deers, boars, rams, lightning rams, those little horned rabbit things.
Fucking these things look like cats, but they get these long beaky nose things. They're all attracted to my dope, and I can't sell my fucking dope, so I get all these things coming in like crows.
There's also a lot of birds, so that means that there's definitely eggs to be found throughout the lands between, both bird and otherwise, which brings me to the land octopus, which I don't really recommend eating, and here's why. Land octopuses are man-eaters, so don't eat one unless you don't mind trying out the other white meat, albeit indirectly. In order to feed their young and reproduce, the land octopus must consume humans. And that's just a part of their biology, apparently. They seem to be vampiric in nature, as the blood appears to be used as a nutrient to the young. I definitely wouldn't recommend eating the land octopus, or their young, or the eggs of this creature, unless you're a big fan of how copper tastes. And it's because of that you can often find land octopuses on beaches, looking for shipwreck survivors to eat. Now, the most simple and average meal in the lands between is a piece of animal flesh. Big pieces come from carnivorous animals, and little strips come from herbivore animals. Either big or small depending on the animal it came from, or white if it happened to come from a bloodless creature. Cooked and then cured in a variety of different ways, using a variety of different ingredients. And by cured I mean pickled, because curing in the lands between equals pickling. I imagine this was done to preserve the food for longer and more arduous journeys and adventures or undertakings that the average citizen of the lands between was forced to make, at least in its current, rather shattered climate. Makes sense that they'd want to be able to preserve food for as long as they can. But this lands between trademarked pickling has the unique ability of causing the finished piece of meat to give off unique bonuses based on what it was cured with. I imagine this is how the average pauper in the lands between managed to get more bang for their buck. We know the world can be kinda hard on the poor, and I kinda think that's an in-story reason why all these meats give elemental resistance buffs. It just kinda makes sense. Which is kinda wishful thinking in a way, because we know the extremely poor in the lands between were resorting to eating the meat off of chicken feet, and then pickling said chicken feet in silver and gold solutions in hopes that that would grant them some sort of good fortune. That's how bad shit truly was for the poor of the lands between. But I'm digressing. It's worth mentioning, though, that to acquire the ingredients used in the curing of most of these meats, one must first venture into the lands of whatever element the ingredient they're searching for happens to be. For example, if you want a meat that grants you a resistance against frenzy, you better be prepared to walk into frenzied lands and pick up yellow embers and eyes of yellow. Also, pro tip when it comes to the differences between using white flesh and regular old flesh. So when you cure white flesh with one of these medicinal solutions, the effects tend to be much longer lasting, but somewhat weaker in overall strength. Strips of white flesh are most easily found by hunting quote-unquote bloodless creatures. I say quote-unquote because I'm pretty sure these creatures have a bleed animation. But you can acquire it most easily by hunting giant crayfish, and I say easily with a grain of salt there, because unless you know the ways of the crab puncher, then you're really, these crayfish are really going to give you a run for your money. But worry not, these strips of white flesh can also be found on those nasty slugs, or the burning slugs, or those giant land squirts. They look like those things that spew poison from Dark Souls 2, and I think they were also in the Dreg Heap in Dark Souls 3. And also Oracle Envoys. Yep, that's right, you can kill and eat those guys. You know, the weird balloon-headed, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, albinoric, gold pipe-hitting Caesar from JoJo's, bubble spewing. You guys know what I'm talking about. You can eat those guys. The white flesh also drops from the land octopuses, but we've already went over why you probably shouldn't eat those. The safest bet is indeed sniping crabs with some kind of spell or powerful bow. Unless, of course, you know the ways of the crab puncher. Moving on. Now, if you want a delicacy in the lands between, then you probably will have to hunt down a beast liver. I know it sounds gross, but apparently these are considered a luscious fruit of life. Not sure that's what I'd call it, but I guess you never really know until you try something. So these have a chance of dropping from most animals that you'll encounter. Horses, sheep, deer, those little rabbit things which I believe are called spring hares, but they surprisingly do not drop from beastmen. Now these beast livers can be dried using a number of different recipes. These dried livers give off immense buffs based on whatever element was used to dry them. Now these are good and all, but they're sort of on the lower end of delicacies, or I don't even know if I should have used that word for them. They're basically just a step up from the cured meats. Stuff that slightly more well-off peasants would have eaten. Now, if you happen to be a warrior, you may be interested in this import from the Badlands, the most exalted of all flesh, the exalted flesh. Now, you're probably thinking, that doesn't look like any drumstick I've ever seen before, and that's because it is not a naturally occurring drumstick. This delicious dish is prepared by first acquiring a prime piece of animal flesh, and then seasoning it to perfection using the rare arteria leaf, which itself is an interesting herb. It's mostly used in perfume recipes in the lands between, but it has dark red leaves with thick swollen veins, so swollen in fact that a faint pulse can be felt inside the veins. This herb also possesses the innate ability to stir one's blood after consuming it, providing them with an enlivening effect, which is probably why it's used in the buffable types of perfume, specifically the uplifting aromatic and the blood boil remedy. So it's definitely an interesting choice for a seasoning on a meat. Now you also season it with roa fruit, which is another interesting ingredient because it's said that roa cannot be digested by humans, which I imagine doesn't extend to its use as a seasoning or a type of sauce or marinade. However way these damn berries are incorporated in this delicious dish. It's worth mentioning that Roa is found just about anywhere in the lands between. There's a couple subtypes of Roa. There's the frozen kind in the mountaintops and the golden kind in Altus Plateau. But this dish only calls for the regular old Roa fruit that you can find just about anywhere. Now next up, you take a nice hefty beast bone.
Whoa. There's still plenty of meat on that bone. Now you take this home, throw it in a pot, add some broth, a potato. Baby, you got a stew going.
And wrap this seasoned marinated meat around it, creating the illusion of a drumstick or a mutton chop of meat. And I imagine the bone makes the meat a sort of on-the-go food, where you can travel and eat at the same time, the ideal choice for the wandering warrior. So yeah, that might have been an attempt to make it sound better than it actually was, because it's simply described as a lump of animal flesh that's been pickled in a medicinal solution mixed with fiery spices. So, like everything in the lands between, it's pickled. So it looks like the Roa is just sort of used in the pickling solution. But still, that was a pretty fun description though, wasn't it? Now what if you don't fuck with red meat, and you happen to notice that there is no white flesh variant of Exalted flesh? What can you really eat?
There we go.
Look at that. Feast your eyes.
Here we go.
What the hell is that?
These are crabs.
That's right, crabs and crayfish are available in abundance in the lands between. So if you're a seafood enjoyer, you're definitely in luck here, because not only are these easy to prepare, they're also considered extremely delicious. There's just one drawback. We are incapable of harvesting enough prawn or small prawns or crabs or crab legs from actual prawns and crabs. We can only harvest like white strips of flesh. Which, again, does this look like a bloodless creature to you? So that means that the only place to get boiled crab or even boiled prawns is this guy. My guy Blackguard Big Boggart, Elden Ring's very own MF Doom. Now I imagine he's the only one who knows how to perfect the boiled prawn or boiled crab, simply because he's the last true connoisseur who knows not to oversalt left, at least in the lands between. I mean, shit, that might have been knowledge that he learned out there in the lands outside the lands between and brought back with him to the lands between, figuring he'd make a killing selling seafood. It makes sense. He probably wandered into Liurnia and saw the crabs and giant crayfish everywhere and thought, well, this is perfect. I mean, I guess he's more like Elden Ring's very own Gordon Ramsay. British dude with a knack for cooking, seems to check out for me. It is, of course, worth noting that the boiled prawns he sells aren't actually prawns, and the prawns, the giant ones in the game, aren't actually prawns either. They're giant crayfish, crawdads, if you will. But I suppose it doesn't quite roll off the tongue the way prawn does. However, since you're not likely to find freshly boiled prawn or crab meat in the wild, and the white strips of meat that we are able to cut off of these things isn't really all that appetizing, then seek not the crab, seek the crab eggs. This of course also involves hunting crabs, which is best done by beating them to death with your bare hands or with spiked kestis.
We'll live and die by the crab, D. We'll eat off the fat of the sea.
Now there does appear to be a lore reason behind why we can't, harvest decent chunks of crab or even an intact crab leg or any parts of the crayfish. It's simply because we're not connoisseurs. And unfortunately that is not a badge or a talisman we can receive in the game, which sort of leads to Boggart running a monopoly on seafood.
Crabs is sewage proof.
It's also worth noting that crabs aren't the only ones that carry crab eggs. Some prawns visibly have eggs on the outside of their body, and if you kill them, these eggs happen to be crab eggs. Now, I'm not sure if there's some kind of cross speciation going on here or anything like that. I just figured the devs didn't want to put any crayfish eggs in the game for whatever reason. It also looks like some of the stronger giant prawns are suffering from lungworm, which is an actual parasite that targets these type of creatures, albeit much smaller, IRL. Anyway, these delicious crab eggs are said to be even tastier than the meat of the crabs themselves. And despite there being a range of different subtypes of giant crab, there only appears to be one type of crab egg, which is probably for the best. I mean, the silver ones are probably some type of homunculus created by the Carians or the Ray Lucarian sorcerers. The Deathblight ones are afflicted with Deathblight because they're directly above Godwin's corpse in most cases. Sometimes they're just near places with Deathroot. Likely they were eating the death root, so you wouldn't want to eat those crabs or their eggs. But let's move on to an easier to acquire, albeit somewhat taboo, dish. Famous in the southern lands between, specifically Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula, and probably southern Liurnia as well. We are of course talking about the pickled turtleneck meat. I wonder how Pastor Muriel, our very own Turtle Pope, would feel about his kind, or at least regular turtles, being hunted and killed for their neck meat. Would he be horrified, or would he understand? I mean, people do indeed have to eat, and there's no one more open-minded than him across all of the lands between, in my opinion. Personally, I think he'd be cool with it. Now, how does one go about making this tasty treat? Well, you start by finding an unfortunate little shellback and, well, putting the murder on him. After the grim deed, you harvest the neck meat and take it back to a campfire somewhere. Next, you gotta create a bitter medicinal solution using 3 helpings of Roa and 1 helping of Herba, my personal favorite. Now, personally, I would cook this turtleneck meat before I pickled it, but then again, I don't know shit about pickling. Now, the finished product looks to be a bright green, so naturally it provides a stamina buff, or at least a bonus to stamina recovery. It's said that the nutrients churn through the body, practically boiling out endless power. Interesting indeed that this vast wealth of stamina could be mined from, of all things, a turtle. Perhaps there's a story to that, like maybe there's some lore reason behind why the turtles possess all that power. And Muriel too, like we know very little about him aside from the fact that he is really fond of Renala and seems to be native to Liurnia. Since this pickled turtleneck meat is so bitter, it's a damn shame there isn't any Siegbra to be had in this game. Or honestly, anything to fucking wash food down with. It's kind of strange. The only drinks in this game that I can think of are those sleepy ones that Celovus whips up for people. Now, at the end of the day, there's a lot of different food options in the lands between. But if you happen to be afflicted with the flame of frenzy, you may find that a preferable alternative to all this pompous-ass food is to find a fellow human and go full Yellow Jackets, or better yet, go full Army Hammer. Climb up the fucking walls. See, for example, Mount Gelmir and what happened there. Look at all those Landel soldiers just eating their fallen kinsmen. You'll love to see it. Or, now what if you find yourself extremely hungry and in need of a quick fix of food, and it not really mattering where it came from? Well, seek out a living jar, crack it open, and harvest the questionable flesh dumplings that reside within. I call them human meatballs, mainly because, as we know, the insides of the living jars are made up entirely of stewed human flesh. Definitely not something for one who considers themselves a discerning eater. Personally, I just want to know why we can't find any of those giant crow eggs. Seems like you'd be able to make an extremely metal omelet with those. And while there weren't any George R.R. Martin food descriptions, there was a George R.R. Martin poo description. Something tells me he personally wrote the description for the blood-tainted excrement. First of all, what the fuck are the followers of Mog eatin'? Because my god. Mixed inside with half-digested flesh are dense colonies of tiny eggs of unknown but assuredly revolting origin. Something tells me George wrote that description himself, but I can't really prove it. All I know is it reminded me of those weird flesh worms that laid eggs underneath Princess Arya, I believe her name was, Targaryen's flesh, and one of the many stories in Fire and Blood. But as always, I'm getting a bit off topic, and I think we've come to the end of our cooking video. So as always, I hope you guys found that at least mildly informative and entertaining. And if you liked it, please like it. If you disliked it, please dislike it. And if you like hearing me rant on, not always about fictional video game food, but also lore and other nonsense, please consider subscribing. It really helps us here at the Honored Madman out. And when I say us, I really just mean me. I'm really kind of like a one-man operation here. But I like to think I'm getting better at this shit. Anyways, though, enough of all that. Let's get to our outro. The next Elden Ring video will most likely be the famous Radagon project I've been working on. But I'm finally going to start getting into some of the other game content. I got 2 Legend of Zelda videos working, something Fallout related. I was finally able to organize those ideas into some type of a video form. But anyway, I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one. And until next time.
Oh, piss off. What is it now? Oh, I see. You want some of me prawn? Freshly cooked it is. All right then. It's yours. If you can meet the price. I could be persuaded to sell you some other bits too. If you've got the runes. Never met someone with a taste for prawn I couldn't trust. We'd make good mates, I reckon. I'll be seeing you.
You know, I didn't get this thought until right now as I'm editing. Land octopuses are just altered, deceased humans. Think about it, the big one kills a human, it chomps him up, eats him, and then pops out a baby octopus that was likely created from all the human parts that the big octopus consumed to create it. Yeah, those are the thoughts I want to end on.